This episode is presented by Visit Cedar City Bryan Head Tourism Bureau. Discover the art of adventure at Utah's gateway to the parks. Cedar City is within a few hours' drive from 6 different national parks and monuments, and only 30 minutes from fresh snow at Bryan Head Resort. Check out visitcedarcity.com to plan your next trip. This episode is sponsored by the Cedar City Business and Innovation Center. Dedicated to supporting local businesses and entrepreneurs, it provides resources and services aimed at fostering business creation, growth, and retention. To learn more and get involved, visit innovationcenter.cc. Hello and welcome to the Explore Local podcast presented by Visit Cedar City Bryan Head in partnership with Cedar City Iron County Economic Development, produced by Dallas Smith Media, and I'm your host, David Johnson. Okay, today we have a returning guest, Ryan Paul with Southern Utah University, and he is a history professor. And last time we had Ryan on, we talked a lot about tourism. We talked a lot about Main Street, the film industry, with Cedar City and Iron County. So Ryan, we're so grateful to have you on again.
Thanks for having me. It's a joy.
Yeah. Well, it's fun to have these great conversations. And one thing we were telling you before about is one of our most listened to podcasts was actually your previous one, because people really want to dive into the history of Cedar City and Iron County. And there's a lot of pride in where we've come from as a community and where we're going. And so we thought, bringing you on again, let's maybe dive in a little deeper on the history of Cedar City. It may not be all entirely economic development or tourism focus per se, but there's a keen interest in that. And so we thought we would just get into that. And so I think to maybe start off, why don't we start as far back as we can think? I mean, you've got dinosaurs on your shirt. I don't know if we're going to go quite as far back as dinosaurs in Utah, even though Utah's known for dinosaur history as well. But why don't we start off on how did people first come here and get settled? What was some of the first? Who were some of the first settlers here? Because I talk to people all the time. They're like, my family's been here since the first pioneers came across. And that is such a cool thing to know and hear and learn about. And so let's learn a little bit more from you.
Sure. So the ancestral settlers, this is the ancestral lands of the Paiute tribe. And if we're talking about the first Anglo settlers, what we're going to find is, so the first non-Native American individuals to come through here are Spanish explorers. We generally trace it to, there are a couple others, but the ones that most people know of is Dominguez and Escalante, who are looking for a route from Santa Fe to Monterey, right? Yeah. And they're on this journey, which will become known as the Dominguez-Escalante Trail. They get as far up as Utah Lake, up in Utah County, and they come down through this area. They get right about Milford-ish area, little further south, and they decide that it's getting too late, and they throw it up to God to decide whether they should continue or go back. And so it's called the casting of the lots. And in fact, if you go down 200 there's a manufacturing plant there that makes like corrugated rubber piping. There's a marker right there about the casting of the lots. That's not where it happened, but it's the one that's closest to inhabited civilization that we can have. So they throw the bones, they cast the lots, and they decide that they're gonna go back. And so essentially they cast the lots around here, but what they do record in their journals are iron ore, right, as being in this spot. Now, if you fast forward almost 100 years, there's the Mormon pioneers that are coming west. They're fleeing America. Their goal is to come to Mexico, which at this point is what it would be, 1821. They overthrow the Spanish. And so they're coming into the valley of the Great Salt Lake. And as that happens, they're invited to participate in the Mexican-American War with the Mormon Battalion, which is a pretty important story, maybe for another day. So when those guys muster out in Southern California, some of them stay in California, participate in the gold rush. Others come back to the Salt Lake Valley through the Dominguez-Escalante route, which will eventually become the Old Spanish Trail that takes it right through here. One of those guys is named Jefferson Hunt. And Jefferson Hunt also records the vast deposits of iron ore that is just laying on the ground. So he gets up north. The Mormons get here. Brigham Young establishes the community. They settle. This part becomes America. And in fact, when the Americans win the Mexican-American War, Brigham Young says to the president, James K. Polk, we're already here. Why don't we just make a big state called the state of Deseret, and I'll be the governor? And that would include Nevada, Utah, part of Colorado, all of California, Arizona, New Mexico. And James K. Polk says, yeah, that's not going to happen. Right? They knew there was gold there, and it wasn't a big deal. So, but Brigham Young is committed to not have the same experience that happened in Kirtland and in Nauvoo, in Missouri, where the Mormons had been forcibly kicked out, to say the least. That's an understatement.
Sure.
So he creates a series of what we call resource missions. So we think of a mission where you go out and convert people, but he really wants this area, this Utah territory, which will be created in the Compromise of 1850 after the war, to be a safe haven for his people, for the LDS Church. And that he's going to create what he calls the Mormon Corridor, which has come from southern Idaho through all of Utah, essentially present-day I-15, through Nevada, southern Nevada, and into Southern California, even though that's not part of the territory.
So did they refer to it as that back then?
No.
Or that's just kind of a more contemporary.
Right.
Yeah.
So these resource missions, I mean, keeping in mind the biggest populated city was St. Louis, right, between St. Louis and California. So there's no Transcontinental Railroad until 1869. So thousands of people, tons of thousands of people are coming west, whether it's to settle in the Salt Lake Valley or whether it's to settle in Oregon or California. So this is a really important spot, a crossroad. It's called the Crossroads of the West, right? So these resource missions are sent to, one, establish communities for the overflow of people that are coming, right? Not everyone can live in the Salt Lake Valley. We've got to spread that out further. So that's one reason. Secondly, all of these people need the basic necessities of not only survival, but economic power. So you think of things like silk, gold, iron, tobacco. There was a tobacco mission, a cotton mission. There was a wine mission, a Utah wine mission. So these communities were settled to produce these resources. So Brigham Young had access to the journals of Dominguez and Escalante. He had the words of Jefferson Hunt that there was iron here, and iron was essential. Brigham Young famously says, iron we must have, because it's not just about nails and hammers. It's about survival, because back then there's no fortified vitamins, right? To get iron in your body, you cooked in the cast iron skillet and the iron came off in your food and you consumed it. So it was essential for survival at this point. So what he does is he knows there's iron here. He dispatches Parley P. Pratt, who was an early Mormon apostle, to come down here in 4950 to explore the area. And he gets down into Parowan, and at the time there was a lake in Parowan that was salty. And so they called it the Little Salt Lake. And so Parley P. Pratt saw this as a divine stamp of approval. This is the place that they should establish, and they find the iron, and so they build a city and a community in Parowan. They call it the mother town here. Then Brigham Young calls people to this iron mission. So not to get converts, but specifically to produce iron for the benefit of the saints.
Interesting.
So they do, right? And so they call this people, but nobody answers the call. And we have this idea that Brigham Young ruled with an iron fist and the lion of the Lord, but there is time and time again where Brigham Young said, you should do this, and the collective group of some saints said, yeah, that's not going to happen. We're not gonna
We're not working the mines.
We're not going to do that. Right? So no one said, they asked for volunteers. No one volunteered. And then Brigham Young says, okay, if you're not going to volunteer, as the prophet of God, I'm going to call you. So I am asking you as the prophet to go down here. And so they do. So George A. Smith, who's an apostle, leads people. And these wagons they build are not like frontier cross-the-plain wagons. They're like motorhomes. They have stoves in them because they're coming down in the winter because they need to get here so they can sow the crops, right? They can plant early in the spring. So Brigham Young does is, interestingly, one guy that he wants to go is named John D. Lee, who's famous or infamous, depending on how you want to think about it. And John D. Lee says, I'm not going to go until Brigham Young comes and tells me himself. And so Brigham Young did. So they come down here, Parowan, they set up the community. They realize that Parowan is just a little too far away. So they come into the Cedar Valley, because in the spot where we are now is almost equal distant from the iron on to the west, and the coal, which is in the canyons to the east.
Oh, gotcha.
So Cedar becomes the central spot of this, and they begin this process of mining iron.
Wow, that's cool. That is awesome to think about. You know, you mentioned kind of something a little bit right before that, that I actually really appreciate. You mentioned kind of the ancestral history. Can you give us just a 30,000 foot level of some of the ancestral history and the native tribes that are from this area?
Sure. So the Paiutes are, and to be very clear, I don't speak for the Paiute tribe. I mean, their history is vibrant and powerful and broad and really deep and spiritual. I think is really
and our
important.
hope is to have someone from the Paiute tribe come on the podcast to be able to help share some of that.
So the Paiutes are a people who were living in the land and moved seasonally. So they would, and there are a number of bands of Paiutes, so they're not all the same.
Sure.
And they occupied this area seasonally, and then when the seasons change, they'd move further south or further north, generally construct their houses there. And the LDS Church saw them as early on converts, right? If you understand the fundamental idea of Mormon doctrine, that at the time the assumption was that these people were all descended of the 12 tribes, and that they were going to accept the gospel of the church. Didn't turn out that way. Unfortunately, the Paiutes were also being enslaved by other Native American tribes, and so in a weird roundabout way that's fairly complex, when Utah becomes a territory, there's a doctrine called popular sovereignty, where slavery is the big question in America, one of those things. And the popular sovereignty says that we're going to let the people of the territory decide whether to accept slavery or not. And the Mormons in Utah choose to enter as a slave state, as a slave territory, right? Not a state yet. Because, one, there were a number of Latter-day Saints that had slaves. Two, that Brigham Young saw this Native American Paiute slavery as problematic and wanted to create a system of indentured servitude where you could essentially, you could buy Paiute slaves and then free them like indentured servants. So they become part of this means to an end in some pretty serious colonization efforts. And what's interesting is that at the time there were 5 major tribes in Utah, and each one of those have different attitudes towards the Mormons and different ways of figuring that out as well that are pretty distinct.
Yeah, and I think you see that kind of across America at that time, right? Where there you have ancestral cultures and these pioneers, so to speak, especially all across the West, where there's these sorting out of the conflicts of settling and resettling, I guess you could say. I don't know if you'd put that differently, but I would say while each area has their own unique story, the context of the melding of these different cultures and histories coming together and settling was a very common theme around that time in American history.
Right. And what's unique about Utah specifically is because this isn't just manifest destiny people, right? These are people who believe that they are called by God to be here. So it's not just the idea of, of American expansionism, but it's this religious motivation to be here and to be a part of that. So the Paiutes, like other tribes, suffer from that pretty aggressively.
Interesting. Well, let's transition a little bit now. When some of the early settlers came to Cedar, and this is what I would like to get into, is the actual settling of creating Cedar City. creating Iron County. Who were some of the early players in creating Cedar City and creating Iron County, and what roles did they play in creating the communities themselves, the community itself?
Sure. So George A. Smith, who was a member of the Quorum of the 12, is the one that leads all this. Parley P. Pratt will come down as the early explorer, but then he's going to be killed in Arkansas a few years later. Then you have people like, so George A. Smith, you have Peter Schertz, you have Isaac Haight, Henry Lunt are these names who people know pretty well. So when they decide to settle in Cedar City, the first place they settle, it's called the Wagon Box Camp, and that is right across from the current hospital. So there's a dialysis type place there, and there's a monument there actually, and a big rock with a monument on it. And if you look at it, you can see that it's kind of a sheltered J on the cliffs behind it. And so essentially, they took their wagons, took their wheels off, used the wagons as a home, and they built these kind of brush shelters that look like U's in front for their campfires. And that's the first place they stayed. They weren't there that long because they realized that if there was some kind of attack by other people, Native Americans, whatever, that they could just throw stuff down them from the top of the ridge. So they decide, like everyone else, to build a fort. So they moved to what they call Cedar Fort. And Cedar Fort, I-15 cuts it in half. It's by the old Coke bottling plant. I think they call it Fort Cedar. Now there's a development that's there. But that is where they first had the bigger settlement of Cedar City. And then this is where they start mining iron, right? They build the first, what they call the Noble Furnace, which is the big furnace right by the where the public library is now, just down the street by Mountain America Credit Union. They build that there, and they begin this process of mining iron. When they smelt it the first time and they make their nails and things, they have a rider take some up to Salt Lake, and Brigham Young dumps the crate out on the tabernacle pulpit and is like, "We have this is amazing," right?
Yeah.
So then Brigham Young comes down. Cedar City actually by 1853 or 54 is probably the fourth or fifth largest city in Utah, right? Because they need iron, right? And they're sending these people down. So Brigham Young will come down. At this point, Isaac Haight is he's the mayor and the stake president and the commander of the Legion. It's kind of wrapped up in that way. And Brigham Young looks at the fort. He walks up to the hill a little bit, and he stands right about where, right across from the Elks Lodge, right behind Lynn's. There's the TDS building, and he puts his cane in the ground and says, "You need to build up this way." And so that's kind of where modern Cedar City starts. They leave the fort, they relocate the dead people, put them in a new cemetery, and they have this. They begin building Cedar City from that point.
Wow.
Right. Now, the problem is that, well, one, it's in the desert, which is challenging because none of these people, and most of these people who came here were from either Scotland or England, which of course is problematic in and of itself because they're different people. And they had mined iron before, but not this type of iron. Right. This type of iron had, we call it floss, but it had some imperfections in it that now we can chemically get out. But back then you couldn't do it. And so what it meant was the iron was fairly brittle. So there would be times when you'd be pounding your hammer and it would shatter. So it becomes problematic. It's not the kind of iron they need. They get stuck in, like everybody else, these cycles of weather where there's either not a lot of water or not enough. And remember, most of these people in their previous existence across the ocean, their problem was getting water off the land. Not getting water to the land.
Right.
So those things cause problems. There was some disunity amongst the people here, which caused some problems. And eventually the iron mission closed after about 5 or 6 years. They couldn't do it. And really what led to the closing of it was the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which happened in 1857. And so they had this one moment of iron. They try to bring it back, but also the problem was it's a matter of logistics, right? There's no railroad, right? You can only sell frying pans and nails to so many people before the idea of getting it up Salt Lake becomes just too onerous. And by that time, the Transcontinental Railroad is ready to go. And once that happens, there's really no need. for that. So it was initially founded to mine iron. Still to this day, the iron west of us, second largest deposit in the country, is out there, and it doesn't really take off again until the train comes in 1923, and then it's gangbusters.
So that's perfect. That's actually where I wanted to segue in is. With economic development, there has been this long history of rail that has helped kind of buoy up our economy. And we talked about this the last time you were on. It was Union Pacific dubbed Cedar City the gateway to the parks because of its access and bringing people from across the country and internationally to come see these incredible national parks. So talk about how rail got started and what did that mean for the area? How did that shift things for our area?
So Brigham Young was a big fan of rail, right? As there's a discussion of building a transcontinental railroad, and because of the Civil War, it looks very clearly that it's going to come through somehow. It's going to connect somewhere in Utah or nearby. Brigham Young is committed that it connect in Utah, and he invites members of the church to be laborers there. And his pitch is that this will be a faster way for everyone to come to Salt Lake City,
right,
or to Utah, right? I mean, even in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, the LDS Church was a communal church, right? If you really wanted to be part of it, you got to come to Utah. So now the train will make that just not only easier and faster, but cheaper as well. So he advocates that. At the same time, there's a group of non-Mormons that are forming a city in Corinne that want the railroad to stop there because they want to build what they call the Gentile capital of the West, right? So Brigham Young buys a lot of land. He has a lot of Mormon laborers help out and essentially shifts the railroad's perspective to not stop in Corinne, but build their headquarters in Ogden. He wants it to be Salt Lake, but it ends up, he settles for Ogden. And so once that happens, very quickly, Brigham Young and the church begin investing in railroads. Because remember, the Transcontinental Railroad is east and west.
Right.
And what he needs for the Mormon corridor is north and south. So very much the church begins investing in railroad companies to build track. It's not long after 1869 that Ogden and Salt Lake are connected, and they slowly build south. By this time, California is becoming big, and there's a promise that the railroad's going to come to Cedar City. But it really only makes it to Milford and then to Lund before it branches off across the desert and goes to Vegas and Southern California. So that's by the 1870s, 1880s. So Cedar City has this promise of rail coming to it, but it doesn't really happen until 23. There's a rail line between Salt Lake and Los Angeles decades before there's one into Cedar City. And really, it's the iron that does that, right? So this idea now of building a rail spur to Iron Springs and then to Cedar City changes it. And once that happens, then now we can transport iron ore out for smelt, because we don't have a smelter really here. Iron ore out to other places by rail, which changes the game. And then it's after World War II, after Pearl Harbor, when Roosevelt realizes that a lot of the main productions of steel are on the coasts, which is problematic. That's where Geneva really takes off, and we're the supplier for all that.
Interesting.
So rail is critical for Brigham Young, and everyone sees rail, not everyone, most everyone sees rail as the future and the survival of this community, because after Mountain Meadows, the population of Cedar City drops from 1,000 to 300. And it's really only sheep and cattle that keep that moving until the train comes. And there's this group of people who believe in the university, the college, who believe in the beauty and the power of this community that really drive that home and want their kids to stay here, and they see rail as that future.
So how then did they start? And you talked about the iron ore. Did it expand beyond the iron, or were there other? Well, I guess I mentioned tourism coming through, and then you've talked about iron. Are there other means and ways that the rail made a difference in the community and helped grow it up, or were those kind of the two primary?
Well, I think that it changes a lot of things economically, right? I mean, certainly one could argue between 1857 and 1923, the the college, that institution is the cultural center and brings people here for a variety of reasons. But the train brings dollars, right? Because it like I say, it hauls the iron out. Of course, people are employed in those mines and they're spending money in the community. But even more importantly, remember that's part of the challenge in the early iron mission, right? Is that people in the community were buying it, but that was it. Right. But now people are not only buying the iron internationally, those people that are producing that iron who are mining it are living in Cedar City, paying taxes, going to school, buying groceries, all that stuff. So once the train comes in and they really make a concerted effort to get the train to come here for tourism. A lot of people see tourism as the future of Cedar City. And in fact, they're out boosting it, right? This is a community-led effort on every way. The school, the church, the government, local booster organizations see this as a big boon to Cedar City because the train comes in. So we don't just take iron out, we bring people in to see the iron rusting on the mountains, right? To see the red rock. Right. And then we use this, as I said, the gateway. And so the railroad does a really good job of providing opportunities for people to shop here in Cedar City. I think I may have mentioned this, but so Randall Jones, who's a photographer, a booster, he'll meet groups in Cedar City. He knows when they're going to be at the Grand Canyon. He takes a picture of them at the Grand Canyon. He's taking a picture of them at Cedar City, and then he drives home. And so when you come back, you have time to buy the photo of you and your group at Grand Canyon. Right? It's this forerunner of the roller coaster camera, right?
Yeah, I was going to say they beat Disney to the punch on that, that market.
So the railroad actually carved out time in their schedule for you to get back to Cedar and have time to walk Main Street, to shop, to buy souvenirs, to eat, to have some food, all of that stuff. And so it not only improved the economy of Cedar City, it made our Main Street very, very viable and very, very important in a variety of ways. So, and it's not just because of the tourists, right? The movie Hollywood comes in that way. It just changes everything.
Wow, that's awesome to hear about. I mean, that almost reminds me of, now we have these cruises that people go on, and you have your little stops along the way and taking the pictures in a similar way. And I didn't even realize that they'd been thinking in that way for tourism and visitors and people that are coming to work in the same way. And that makes a lot of sense with our historic downtown, why it has such a meaningful place in the community's hearts. Not just for the new people who are like, oh, this is a cool historic downtown, but generationally, there's always been this special place in everybody's hearts about our historic downtown, which that makes a lot of sense. But I didn't realize how the railroad really tied into that.
Yes, I mean the train would stop at the train station, right at the south end, 200 North, and then you'd have those blocks of Main Street up to Center, so you could walk up both sides. And there were not, so these weren't just tourist shops, but this is where the community shopped for their groceries and went to the mail and went to church, and so this was really the center. And it all comes from where, I mean, it's no surprise that where that train station is where Brigham Young, a block, a little further up, puts his cane down and says, "This is where it should start." So it really is important to think about it in that way.
So one other thing that you mentioned a couple times is the university, Southern Utah University, and kind of the role that it played. Talk to me a little bit about how did SUU get started, and maybe you can give just a brief overview of how SUU got started here and why that was so important here locally. And then there's a couple fun stories about SUU and keeping it alive, so to speak, throughout the years. Maybe you can dive into some of that.
Sure. So the college now, which first was called the Branch Normal School, in the late 1800s, the state thought that we needed to provide teachers for all parts of not only rural Utah, but Arizona and Nevada, and that at the time the University of Utah was the one that did a lot of that teacher training. So they said, we want to build a teacher training school that would be part of the University of Utah in the southern part of the state, of the territory of the state. So they put the ad out, they put a call out, Beaver, Cedar City, Parowan, lots of communities apply to make that happen. And through a long story, Cedar City gets chosen. At the time, they had what's known as the district school, which was kind of by the Rock Church, and the first year of school was held there. And they'd made a promise that the state law said that you had to give all the land and build the building by a certain time. Well, the assumption was that the state would be okay with them. We'll give you the district school, but the land that the deciding group had chosen was the land offered up by the residents of Cedar City, which was called Temple Hill. So if you think about where Old Main, which is the oldest building on campus, stands, that was the hill that the early church members who settled here had set aside for the building of the temple.
Oh, okay.
The LDS temple, the most sacred building that they had. So it was really important. But this is how important they thought education was. That this was not only a temporal but a spiritual salvation to give this land up for the building of this institution. But, and still it's murky as to how this happens, but we kind of get, someone tells the legislature, well, wait a minute, they're not following the letter of the law. And so the legislature says, if you want this to happen, you've got to have the building built on the land that you promised us by this certain time. So they had already collected materials. They'd already done some stuff to prepare to build the next spring, but they realize now they're going to have to do it faster. And so that's the story of Back Up the Mountain. They have materials that are cut and ready to go up there, but it's way up in the sawmills, and they go up there and they sacrifice to bring all that stuff down and build this building, which is Old Main, to get done in time to meet the letter of the law, which they do, right? And Old Main becomes the center of this institution called the Branch Normal School, which a normal school was the training of teachers. That these people in this community gave up so much to build that building, and then the campus grew from there. But people are mortgaging their homes. They're collecting stuff to provide this opportunity to build this structure. So the community, with 5 professors first, and then it'll become the Branch Agricultural College, which will shift from teacher training to more agricultural training out of Utah State. And then eventually, as you know, the College of Southern Utah, and eventually Southern Utah University.
That is so awesome. Are there any other fun stories that come to mind when talking about the expansion of Southern Utah University that people might be interested in hearing?
Yeah, well, I think there's multiple times where this institution was challenged financially, right? Where it was going to be closed. One is, of course, during the Great Depression, where the state thought, do we really need state-funded institutions here? And maybe during the depression we should close that. The university early on, and still does, was very committed to arts and culture. And so a couple of the professors, a choral professor and a music professor, had created a community-led Messiah, singing of the Messiah, Handel's Messiah. And that's important to note, is that Old Main and the university became the leader really in cultural resources of the state. And it wasn't just students performing in the orchestra or singing in the choir, it was community members as well. It became a tradition. And so as these legislators committee was coming down to decide what to do, whether to keep it or not, they say, well, let's do this Messiah to see how connected it is to the community. And the legislature said, okay, we'll go, but we need chairs they chose chairs by the door. So, they could leave when they wanted to.
Right, yeah.
But they were so blown away by this college and by the community and what they were doing that they went back to Salt Lake and said, we got to save this. You can't close this institution. And then you fast forward to World War II, where, of course, students were challenged because a lot of the guys were off to fight. People were staying at home. And this is where Walter Granger, who was a local, had been elected to U.S. Congress. He was a local congressperson. And he worked with the Army Air Force to train pilots here. It's the beginning of our aviation program, right? So the federal government put lots of money into Cedar City to train pilots. They turned the LS Glennie Hotel into dorms. And so it's this other funding that helped keep that university moving forward. And there are times again when those things are threatened and people really begin to see the value of this institution, right? When Old Main burns down in the 1940s, right? And Old Main is also the library. And so students are climbing up fire escapes, throwing books out of the windows, forming human chains to save as many of the books as they can. And and eventually the building crumbles and the big old bell at the top comes crashing down. And they commit that we're going to, I mean, that was the time when they think, well, maybe we just need a different type of building or maybe we need to change things. But they commit to rebuild it. And they do. So time and time again, not just with the university, but in lots of things, this is community above self. This community really steps up and sacrifices to keep this place alive.
You know, what's interesting when you're talking about that story about the Handel's Messiah, you talked about the legislators coming down. And one of the things that I have seen that's been so important for our community, we're a very self-sufficient community, which is why we have a really diverse economy, you know, everything from the arts to manufacturing and rail to retail to tourism. We just have a really diverse economy. But one of the things that I have found in my job that's been really essential is making sure that those state decision makers are regularly engaged with what we're doing here in our community. Doing so has helped those relationships, have helped them see the value of what we have going on in Cedar City, Iron County, and quite frankly, southern Utah as a whole. I know President Mindy Benson with SUU has been a big advocate with engaging the state. They just recently did, I believe they were the first university in the state to do this economic impact study. And now a lot of other universities, or I think all the universities now, are in the middle of doing a similar economic impact study to showcase, look, here's the value that we bring. So we're not out of sight, out of mind. We're showing our value not just to our local community that we love and hold dear, but to the state as a whole, and how we can work as a sister market in Utah to Salt Lake and the Wasatch Front, right? I don't know if you kind of have thoughts or stories kind of how historically that connection between our local community and state officials or even federally, how that has helped sustain us throughout the years.
Well, I think that it's important. I mean, Cedar City is in a unique position because, one, rural Utah is rural Utah, right?
Sure.
And what, 70-80% of the state population lives in the Wasatch Front, and there's arguments to be made about majorities and those kinds of things. I would argue that, you know, the United States Constitution is set up to protect the rights of the minority against the tyranny of the majority. But I think that that's important to recognize that we're also in rural Utah, but we're sandwiched between one of the fastest growing cities in the country and northern Utah, right? You've got St. George, which eclipses us economically and politically. And we have this decision to make about where we sit in that spectrum, right? Because Utah Tech is there, and for the long time, the history of SUU has been, you know, are we being proactive or reactive to what Utah Tech is going to do or what legislature are going to do there in St. George? But I think that time and again, this is what makes Cedar City unique, is because we are in that spot where you exist at a different part, that you have the best of the rural part, but also the best of the urban part. Unlike anywhere else in the Wasatch Front, unlike St. George, we have the best of both worlds, and getting politicians to see that is one thing, and getting them to act on it is another. I think Utah is an important way to get people down here and make serious commitments to what rural Utah really is. And in fact, you know, we're the only town in southern Utah that's had a sitting president come through in 1923, and people are advocating for that. And so people were advocating for that. So I think that certainly that's not outside the realm of what our leaders are thinking.
Yeah.
Right? Because our tax base, by definition of being in rural Utah, is limited. I mean, we we took lots of money from the federal government in the 1930s, right? We used that support, which is actually part of the preamble of the Constitution, right? To promote the general welfare, the health, happiness, and fortunes of people or groups. So that's why that money exists. And so I think that we think about how that's going to play out, not only regionally, but statewide. What I find exciting about SUU and Cedar City is it more and more is becoming a regional leader in certain fields.
Yeah.
And that's really an incredible testament to the community that came before us. I mean, we're who we are because they are who they were.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's really critical to understand, especially as we carve out our way in this unique political landscape.
So you mentioned a couple things that I think is really important to highlight of where we are today, and that is you're kind of highlighting this regionalism. So one of the things, for example, SUU has recently worked with Utah Tech and with Snow College to implement a workforce program called the Future Ready program, and that program is meant to buoy up these rural communities and to create a workforce pipeline that trains not only the up-and-coming generation, but to help provide workforce training to the existing workforce that's out there. And in fact, we received federal funding because it is very uncommon for 3 universities to come together and say, hey, we need to make this happen. When you mentioned that 70-80% of our towns in Utah are rural, probably like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, I literally went through the population of every community in Utah. And I'm going to use some round numbers because I don't remember the exact numbers, and it's probably changed slightly since. But what I found was that around 80% of our communities were populations of under 10,000, whereas 80% of the population were in those 20% of the communities above 10,000. I hope I said that correct. And what I found is that the majority of the communities in Utah are these rural communities. Now, I've classified rural in 3 different ways in Utah because they're very distinct. We have your classic rural, which I would say is Iron County. You have your remote rural, which is kind of like San Juan County in southeastern Utah and some other areas. And then you have your transitioning rural, which are communities that are almost like rural hubs like Cedar City. Cedar City proper is not necessarily rural, but it's a transitioning rural that supports all of these rural communities. And a great example of that is our Walmart is the number 1 grossing Walmart in sales tax in the state and the number 2 for visitation. We have people from Panaca in Nevada that are coming and shopping here because of the way we service this rural community. And so when you're talking about this regionalism and the regional benefit, it seems to me like this natural progression through some of the history that we've been touching on here as well. And I don't know, I'm kind of going off on a monologue here, but I don't know if you have thoughts kind of where we are today and how that history has played into that.
Well, I think some of the best advice I ever got was from a guy who told me, if you like where you are, you find reasons to stay and not reasons to go.
Yeah.
And if you look at all of the things that, whether it's the university, whether it's the Utah Shakespeare Festival, which we could have a whole thing about, whether it's summer games, all of this stuff, it is people who are finding reasons to stay.
Yeah.
And so all of these things that are transitioning Cedar, I mean, we may not think of ourselves as rural, but certainly a lot of other people do.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And so I think that it's this idea of we're providing all of that for us to stay that the rest of the world can benefit from.
Yeah.
Right. And share in that idea. So I think as you talk about jobs and everything else, we're in that same boat, right?
Yeah.
I'm not confident my kids could find jobs in Cedar City to afford to live here.
Yeah.
And we need to and those are the hard conversations that we need to have, is that how do we figure that out in the systems in which we live?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that I tell people about. My job is to help create jobs, to help diversify our economic viability. And so there's so many people that I know whose kids have moved away and would love to move back. But the situation is, whether it's housing or the job type or any of those types of things, it's trying to find that healthy mix where we have enough growth so generationally we can continue to live here without getting too crazy like some of our neighbors in the Wasatch Front or Washington County. And so trying to keep that steady, healthy growth, but address our needs. You know, sometimes with growth, the hard part is having your cake and eating it too, sort of that old adage. You know, we want a Costco and we want a Target, but we don't necessarily want a population of 150,000 in a 5-mile radius, which those entities a lot of the times require, right? And so
we don't want to stop shopping at a Costco or Target, so they'll come up here.
Yeah, right.
Because why buy the cow if the milk's free? If we're going to go down, that's why they get your zip code, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to go down and shop at Costco, then they're going to say, why would we invest?
Yeah, and so it's trying to find that right balance of the growth and the progression. But I think one thing that you said that I think has been a common vein and thread throughout the history of Iron County is finding, and you'll have to correct me on the way you phrase this, but is finding the reasons to stay here, finding a way and a means to stay here. And I think that's what Cedar City and Iron County, from my limited knowledge and history and talking to you and just getting to know the community, that's been a common theme. And that's something that we're continuing to do today. And that has pros and cons to it. It has growing pains to it. But hopefully we're doing it in a balanced way that makes our community continue to be something that we love and maintains that integrity of what we love about our community here.
Yeah, I think if history is to be our guide here, I mean, I believe that story matters. And I think what we're finding is that it matters more than we thought that it does, right? That we're connecting back and forth. And that's why I think studying history is important for a variety of reasons. But I think that if history is our guide, what we find is every time this community has been threatened, whether it's closing the bank, whether it's the Old Main burning down, whether it's Shakespeare Festival challenges or summer games or political issues, the one thing that has saved it time and time again is the community has unified behind the purpose of staying, of keeping this community viable and vital to happiness. And that is our greatest challenge, because we're living in a time where people are profiting, and not just financially, but in all ways, over disunity. It is in some people's interest to keep us apart, right? And that is the only way we will fail as a community, is if we disintegrate in that way. If we do not unite behind those things that make our community important and viable. And those things may not be what you all want or what I all want, but every time this community has been threatened, the citizenry has gotten together, regardless of political divide, and done what they could to make this a place to want to be.
Yeah.
And I think that is where our challenge is today, is to find those things, which, by the way, I think are much more prevalent. Our commonalities are much closer, are much greater than our differences.
Sure.
And to focus instead not on our differences, but on our commonalities of why this is important. And we will not only survive, we will thrive and prosper.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And that is a great note to end on. And it's something that I've said throughout this podcast, and both the first season and this season, is our ability to collaborate. And you use the word unity. And I mean collaborate. We talked a little bit in the beginning of some of the history and the melding of histories together. And what I've seen in this community is of histories of culture, religion, politics, industry types. I've seen those different areas be able to come together, a lot of times with very stark differences and opinions, but be able to come together with the sense of we're one community, and let's leverage that rather than letting it hold us back. And I think that's what Cedar City and Iron County has always had going for it, and that's what's helped us move together successfully and will continue to do so in the future. So, well, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. Ryan Paul, history professor at Southern Utah University. Pleasure to have you again, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again soon.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.